sound. Okay. And this is close enough to the mic. Okay. Hi, and thank you, Jayati and Chandru, for organizing this and inviting me. And I will now go back to like the bigger picture again. And for me, when I heard the title of this panel, The Political Economy of Debt Crisis Resolution, what I thought is like in the international financial architecture that we have today, who gets to decide what is a debt crisis and who gets to decide, when a debt crisis is resolved? Like, what does that mean? And are we considering the parts of how is the debt even accumulated? And that's how I'm kind of getting to the conclusion that to really resolve debt crisis in a way that's consistent with countries reaching sustainable development goals, being able to invest in climate and development, we need a new international financial architecture and a new system. And on the idea of, are we in a debt crisis? So these are some figures from a paper that we released this week at the Center for Economic and Policy Research that I worked with with my colleagues that show a bit of the burden of debt service for low and middle income countries overall, and also for the G24, because one of the co-authors on this paper was Angelica Huerta, who works at the G24, so we also looked at them as a group. And we can see that it's very high. A lot of this is external debt service, and a lot of the resources and the revenue of these countries are going towards debt service. And we also calculated here, and we saw that out of the 120 countries that we had data for, 92 were spending more on on debt service than on SDG investments if we take the climate part out, and 52 were spending more on debt service than they would need to spend just on climate investments in terms of percentage of GDP, which is a rough estimate, but it kind of gives the picture that for many of these countries, even though clearly we're not on track to achieve the sustainable development goals, a lot of the resources and more of the resources are going towards debt service than that. And then we also have the statistic on all the debt service that Danielle repeated yesterday too from the UN, that 3.3 billion people live in countries where that more is spent on debt service and on healthcare and education. So now, if we take this context, the IMF would say we're still not in a systemic debt crisis, even though, as Richard said, UNCTAD was saying we're in a systemic debt crisis already in 2019 when things were a little better. And now, especially if we introduce the climate dimension too, we have, in our paper too, something that others have described as well as like the idea of the vicious cycle and a debt trap. And this, adds more of the debt for climate dimension too, where climate finance mostly comes in the form of debt. That's the same with other development finance. So, these countries are asked to accumulate this debt, but then as they accumulate more debt, they are then, also paying higher interest and more debt service. They have less space to actually make the investments they need. They are staying in this position of vulnerability. So when a disaster hits, and especially in the climate disaster angle, they're not prepared, they're not able to deal with it. The infrastructure is like in a place where a lot of things get destroyed. And then, what happens then? They also have to borrow to fix that. So there's even more debt. And then to service the debt too, often for like the exports and, how they can do that is also by extractive industries that again make the climate aspect worse. So that's why, it's a vicious cycle that needs to be broken. And just to look at, we looked at the credit ratings and, IMF risks for countries in the paper, and 79 countries, based on that were identified as at risk of debt distress. And we can see in this image that, there's a big overlap with the countries that have debt problems and the countries that are very vulnerable to climate shocks. And those two issues are very closely linked. And just general, coming back to how uneven the financial architecture is, this is, the immediate COVID response. I realize there's no year on the first figure, but that's for 2021. And it's, IMF's calculation that after COVID in the immediate response, we had the group of advanced economies that spent, 11.4% of their GDP extra to deal with it, and then emerging economies, low-income economies, could not do that. And then the figure below is also before interest rates went up, but it kind of shows the fact that it's the total like interest as a percent of GDP that's paid on that service. That so-called developed economies, even though their public debt ratios are very high, pay the lowest interest almost out of everyone else, and that it's not about developing countries are paying more on interest because they're like less fiscally responsible or whatever. It's because we're in a financial architecture that's very uneven, and the terms at which different countries borrow are very different. And now going back to how are these debt issues addressed? So and they are addressed in a way that doesn't really take into account this context I just talked about of the different terms and the different policies. And even though we can see that the landscape of creditors has changed a little bit, and I'm glad that before me the idea of like the China narrative has been emphasized too, because it's like we hear a lot about that. But China, okay, they did go from 2% to 5%, but they're 5% of the debt stock, and it's not really, it's something that like is a finger to point at, but they're not the ones holding back, restructurings and other things. And that's, at the end of the day, despite the more complicated landscape and the role of private creditors, it's still really the IMF that handles any debt restructuring. And I have here a quote from the IMF page, where the IMF, generously offers to support members by providing sound economic policies and new financing, enabling the return to macroeconomic viability. That's, their thing. But, in practice, this is, to have a little bit of fun. The first picture is if the IMF were a doctor, what would happen? And we can see all the different pages. Yeah, so the first one is if the IMF were a doctor, and it's, here, try this, it's my only medicine. And then, we see different patients with different illnesses, and no matter what the problem is, the IMF has the same recipe of structural adjustment and the same program for everyone. Yeah, I think these comics come from, Argentinian, Brazilian people. I think there's like where the art comes from. And then the other one is, spot the difference in the two pictures. And, the answer is there is no difference, just the same place after 10 years of structural adjustment. But then that is actually a compliment, because if we're going to look at the example of Greece, and we're going to see Greece after 10 years of like an IMF project, actually if things were the same, that would be a victory, because Greece economy is still significantly smaller. And the first graph is my own there, which kind of traced how throughout the IMF agreements with Greece, the goalposts were consistently moved, like little by little, in what the IMF was projecting that the impact of austerity will be. And that's kind of where we started, and then like with each review of the program, it like goes down and down and down, and that's where we're actually at. And then, the FT did my homework by having this piece last week on just how bad Greece is doing, how Greeks have become the second poorest in the EU, and just how much wages have dropped in Greece. But in the international financial architecture that we have today, if we were gonna ask, the Greek debt crisis has been resolved. And that's also where, I want to mention a little bit of like, there's also the idea that there's a new IMF and that the IMF has changed. And there, again, it's one of my favorite pictures, 2019 spring meetings, when they had an event that was Income Inequality Matters, how to ensure growth benefits the many and not the few. And then above we have Georgieva with a woman work and leadership, sort of like the new image of the IMF. But despite this new image, they haven't actually changed, what they do on a day-to-day basis in their program. And then, going back and tying to what we heard in the panel, earlier this morning, why is there this lack of accountability? And here we have the last time they released a review of programs, that was 2019, a new one is coming up soon. But by the own metric that the IMF came up with to evaluate its own programs, we can see that even they could only claim that a third of programs were successful. And that's their own metric from their own evaluation. And then in the idea of, why doesn't anything change if they're so bad at their jobs? That's where like the graph below is from like a paper I did on the IMF quota system. And I think it gives you the answer because it's, okay, where are IMF programs happening? What are the countries where these programs are failing and causing all of these issues? And who has the most voting power at the IMF? And we can see that, yeah, the IMF is not accountable to its borrowers. It's accountable to creditor countries, and the countries that even when the program actually, fails for the country there, their, bondholders, other financial institutions are getting repaid. And then just to kind of take a step back of like, oh, when it's not just an IMF program in like a bigger debt crisis, like there's been, some efforts over the last decades where we had these broader initiatives of debt restructuring, but I think most of them can be characterized as too little, too late, or maybe if it wasn't too little, it was too late. And that's just kind of like things that kept the system going without really reforming it, but addressed issues when things really got very, very bad. So overall, it's, the problem is a broken architecture that just keeps countries indebted. And that's like how we see that the way we deal with things and the IMF programs are not consistent with pro-development policies. Even the issue that like the IMF is taking on climate, it's very concerning because once they have the power to put conditions, it means they get to be in charge of climate policy for all these countries, and they're taking things away from like what would have been the UNFCCC principles of polluters pay and having a climate justice angle there to market-based solution, price signals as the answer to the climate crisis. And through their position in this financial architecture that we have today, it means that they actually might get to be the ones designing climate policy, even though they shouldn't be. And the issue at the core of this is like that, and it builds on what has been said before me, that developing countries are forced to consistently borrow in dollars, and they're in a position of financial subordination where they need these dollars. They have to borrow in dollars. They can only do that at very high costs. And that's like a systemic problem that has to be like addressed, because otherwise the way we look at it now and the IMF DSAs, they don't care about development needs, they don't care about the needs of the population, they care about how these external creditors are gonna get repaid. And just to end, but it's like to really break this cycle and have that resolution, we need a new international financial architecture. That's one thing, and it's very important that there is a mechanism for debt resolution that's part of that, but also other sources and ways to have financing, because getting rid of the debt will help, but unless there's like other things in place to change the pattern of debt accumulation, it's not going to last very long. And then the other thing that I just want to end with too is that fixing the international financial architecture won't solve all the problem. It's also important to fix other aspects of multilateralism, so that countries have the space for industrial policy and they need technology transfers. But without fixing the IFA, it's going to be much harder to achieve the other things. Thank you.